Welcome to Family Basics 101. I'm Dr. Bruce McClure, and as we begin a 5-part series on the types of abuse, today we will simply spend time defining abuse. Today we will look specifically at a working definition of abuse. On tomorrow we will look at the major classes of abuse. On Wednesday we will talk very specifically about physical abuse. On Thursday, we will look very specifically at sexual abuse. And finally, on Friday, we will talk very explicitly about how to expose abuse. Let's begin by giving a simple yet a very detailed definition of abuse. It's any action that willfully or ignorantly harms another person. So you hear even in legal circles, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And that is nonetheless true when it comes to abuse. Abuse occurs when one person mistreats another person by showing no concern for the impact that it has upon the person being abused. Abuse will be more broadly explained in a later show. But it can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be mental, or it might even be sexual abuse. And in many cases, there probably are components of all of the above, or in any demeaning manner through the relationship, whether it's direct or indirect intimidation, that is also considered abuse. So keep in mind that any demeaning manner that is precipitated against an individual is also considered abuse. Let's talk about another word for abuse that is more prevalent in our society, and that's the term domestic violence. It's simply another name for abuse. But in domestic violence, the abuse is targeted at a specific population of people that are known in a sort of a more intimate relationship by those being abused. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, any willful intimidation, any physical assault, battery, sexual assault, or any other abusive behavior invoked by an intimate partner against another is defined as domestic violence. When we talk about domestic violence / abuse, we must always consider who it impacts. Let's move away from the individual and let's talk more globally about the impact of domestic violence and abuse. It impacts the community. It impacts every nationality. It impacts every educational background. It impacts every religious entity. It impacts every age group. So often we think we can identify an abuser just by looking at him or her. And so many times we think we can identify a person who is the recipient of abuse or domestic violence simply by looking at him or her. And most of the professionals in the field, whether it's the medical field, whether it's the psychological field, whether it's the social services fields, will tell you that you cannot readily identify abusers just by their external appearance and their external conversations only. There are abusers and there are abused people in every community, every nationality, every educational background. One of the myths is that it is the undereducated that are involved in domestic violence or abuse. And yet, many people who are master levels, doctorate levels, professionals are involved in domestic violence and abuse, and their profession cloaks it because many people feel if I'm at this level of achievement, if I live in this type community, if I practice this type religion, or if I'm at a certain age group, then I must be exempt from abuse or domestic violence. And those are some of the reasons that it is perpetuated. Let's look closer at the definition of abuse. It's any attempt to control, any attempt to dominate others by a systematic process of emotional and physical means that always demoralizes the victim. It dehumanizes the individual, and the attempt is to move a person from their internal comfort level, their internal well-being, to one that is externally dependent upon the abuser for internal consolation and direction. So it takes away the internal control of the individual, and it surrenders that internal control externally to the abuser, who will then internally abuse their victim. Sadly, almost every abuser has been abused by a primary person in their own personal life, and typically that abuse took place between birth and 10 to 12 years old. A sad commentary that a person who has been the recipient of domestic violence, a person who has been the recipient of abuse, will later in life turn right around and become the abuser. Let's talk about a Bible story and abuse. In the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 25, verses 14 through 17, there's a story about a man by the name of Nabal. Nabal is a man that is really defined as a fool. He has no regard for anyone. He has no regard for people who love him. He has no regard for people who work for him. He has no regard for tranquility. That sounds like people who are abusers. They have no regard for anyone around them. They have no sensitivity for the feelings of others. Everything about an abuser is designed to give some type internal control to that abuser, and to take away every ounce of control from the individuals that they are abusing. So in this story in 1 Samuel 25, there's a man by the name of Nabal. He has no regard for anyone, and because of that, he gets his entire family in trouble with the king. But one of the young men told his wife, and his wife went to the king, and she pleaded the cause of her foolish husband. But even as she pleaded the cause of her foolish husband, he went about his daily business still being an abuser, not realizing had it not been for his own wife intervening, he would have been killed in everything that he owned. When she told him the end of the story, he was astonished that his wife rescued him. He really never recovered from what he had done, and ultimately he dies. Here's the end of the story about abuse and people who perpetuate domestic violence. Typically, they never stop. They will move from person to person to person, and they will abuse, and they will abuse, and they will abuse. It is very painful, and it's almost as if you're taking control away from them if in any shape, form, or fashion they have to surrender abnormal behavior of abuse. I'll see you back in class again tomorrow. Don't be late, and don't skip class.